When you have all the wealth in the world, you don't really think too much before doing anything. But doing things without thinking often has bad consequences. Consequences you eventually have to face. And that has been the arc of our favorite character, Iron Man, also known as Tony Stark. He started off as an arrogant weapons manufacturer, but his story ended with him becoming one of the greatest heroes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this only happened because Tony Stark never ran away from his mistakes, whether the problem was created by him, his father, or anyone else. Tony always faced his demons with responsibility. And this video is about exactly that. Proof of how Tony Stark has always been the most accountable hero. But this accountability also has a dark side, which we will witness through another character in Avengers Doomsday. So without further delay, let's begin. The Iron Man. Back in 2008, when Iron Man was introduced to the world, Tony was a billionaire blinded by wealth and fame. But soon enough, he faced his very first demon, his own weapons. In the caves of Afghanistan, he discovered that the Jericho missiles created by his company, Stark Industries, were now being used by the Ten Rings for terrorism. The same weapons from Stark Industries had been used by the Ten Rings to seize Gulmira. The moment Tony found this out, his very first decision was to shut down Stark Industries' weapons division forever. And after seeing the news on TV, he personally went to Gulmira and destroyed the Ten Rings there within moments. On top of that, he also took responsibility to defeat Obadiah Stane, the man who was secretly behind all of this under the cover of Stark Industries. And he succeeded. So here we can clearly see that Tony took accountability. But things get even more interesting when we talk about the burden of his father's sins. When the world found out that Tony Stark was Iron Man, Ivan Vanko in Russia was enraged. Because the truth was, the arc reactor was not created by Howard Stark alone. It was originally designed together by Howard Stark and Ivan's father, Anton Vanko. But disagreements soured their partnership, and Howard eventually had Anton deported. That's when a fire of revenge was born. Ivan carried this anger to Tony, showing the world that Iron Man was not as invincible as people thought. The same arc reactor technology Tony had claimed in a Senate hearing to be impossible to replicate had now been replicated by Ivan. The movie continued with Ivan teaming up with Hammer Industries to build unmanned drone armors that could be remotely controlled. This was when we saw just how dangerous and misused Iron Man's technology could become, putting thousands of lives at risk. And once again, Tony had to face his demons, taking responsibility even though Ivan was created by Howard, not him. Everything happening was the result of his father's decisions. Yet the responsibility of stopping Ivan still fell upon Tony, and he stepped up once more. Now let's talk about Tony's own true demons. Iron Man 3 was the story that truly made Tony realize that he was constantly fighting the consequences of his own actions. Aldrich Killian was the very embodiment of those consequences. Rejecting Aldrich at a New Year's party scarred him deeply, so much so that Killian never forgot it. It all came back to explode in Tony's face under the name of Extremis. Killian was the final nail in the coffin of Tony's carefree personality, pushing him into a more cautious, responsible life. He learned that we create our own demons, and that every action has consequences. Consequences we must face sooner or later. Maybe that's why Tony even considered the consequences of his own heroism to be his personal responsibility. This was the reason why, during Civil War, Tony was the very first hero to raise his hand in support of the Sokovia Accords. But the biggest proof of Tony's accountability is seen across all 4 Avengers movies, where he truly stood out as the most responsible Avenger. If you remember, Tony was originally brought into the Avengers initiative only as a consulting entity, not as an active, fighting member. Technically, legally, and necessarily, Tony never had a fight at all. But when Loki's plan unfolded in the Avengers, Tony was the one most enraged by Agent Coulson's death. He wanted to avenge it, and this was clearly shown when he confronted Loki alone in Stark Tower, telling him, "Even if we lose today, it doesn't matter, because we will make sure to avenge it." This is exactly where the term Avengers truly found its meaning. Tony was never bound by any obligation to fight like a hero. but because he knew that the Avengers were formed to protect Earth, and at that moment Earth was in danger, he chose to take responsibility as an Avenger, and he fought. In the end, he fulfilled that responsibility by carrying a nuclear missile into outer space. Tony was also the only one who realized that the Battle of New York was just the beginning. Out there in space, there were forces far greater than the Avengers, forces against which Earth's defenders were nothing. To Tony, their victory in New York was just a flicker of destiny, and he couldn't leave everything up to fate. His greatest fear was that if they ever lost in the future, what would happen then? This fear became real in Avengers Age of Ultron when Wanda peered into Tony's mind and revealed his deepest nightmare, showing him the Avengers defeated and Captain America accusing him. "You could have done more, Tony. Why didn't you?" That's when Tony decided it was his responsibility to create a fail-safe mechanism to protect Earth, even if the Avengers ever lost. And from that very sense of accountability, he mistakenly created his next demon, the Ultron program. Moving forward to Avengers Infinity War, everything Tony did might have looked like just the duty of an Avenger. But remember, Tony always knew Thanos was the true endgame. He didn't know that all the planetary threats he had faced in his life were tied to Thanos, but he knew enough to realize that one day he would come face-to-face with him. Tony didn't want that endgame to reach Earth. That's why he even told Doctor Strange that they had to take the fight to Thanos. And though they lost that battle, Tony survived, only to return in Endgame. By the time of Endgame, Tony had almost everything he could have ever wanted: a loving wife, a little daughter, and the peaceful life he had dreamed of. Yet he knew he couldn't run away from the failure on Titan, nor from the devastation Thanos had left behind. Tony had every reason to stay away from heroics, but even after initially refusing Captain America, Ant-Man, and the others, he still built the time machine. In the end, he sacrificed himself, wielding the Infinity Stones to set everything right before saying goodbye. So, what's the conclusion of all this? You can clearly see now that Tony Stark has always been the man who took accountability, whether the consequences came from his own actions or were somehow connected to larger events. Wherever Tony was, he never ran away from responsibility. But you may have noticed one important drawback in this tendency. Although Tony always faced his demons, he always believed it was solely his responsibility to fix everything. He carried the burden alone, believing only he could make things right. And this habit might remind you of another character. Yes, friends, I'm talking about Doctor Doom. Doctor Doom is the very manifestation of this tendency. He also believes that his way is the only way, that only he can solve everything. The difference between Tony Stark and Doom, however, is small but critical. Tony takes responsibility for problems, even if it means sacrificing himself, whereas Doom takes responsibility by ruling over them, believing others must become his subjects. Tony thinks, "I made the mistake, and I must fix it myself." Doom thinks, "I made the mistake, but only I can fix it by making everyone my slave." Their origins of thought are somewhat the same, but the difference is razor thin. One sees it as responsibility, while the other sees it as destiny. And that's why Doctor Doom will be the shadow of Tony Stark's personality, a darker version of him. Now it's your turn to tell me, what do you think about this parallel between Tony and Doom? Do you believe Doctor Doom will truly be portrayed as a darker version of Tony Stark, or will Robert Downey Jr. bring an entirely different character style to the screen? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.